Compliance thing organized. we do have 3 auditors in the room. Thank you guys all for coming out, and I just appreciate all of it. It's a difficult night with all the rain, so appreciate doing this. Please remember to take your galoshes with you when you leave, so we don't want them left in the room. Before I introduce my speaker, though, I do want to let you know a couple things coming up. We are about ready to launch a brand new website for Chapter 511. It's been some time in coming. And if you look on the website when it comes out, you'll also know that we videotape these things now. The reason why we videotape is because I want to remember how handsome I was 20 years from now when we download the archives, the archive footage, and we say, "Gee, John, I didn't know you were this slender." So we're going to do this so you'll be able to take. It's the best joke I have. You'll be able to, if you're not present, at least be able to attend the meetings vicariously, or at least coming back and looking at the web. The second thing is we agreed on our big October meeting. You know, we normally have one big meeting every year. It'll be at Mangiano's. At least that's tentatively scheduled for that. We have a plan for a number of panel members. I think so. Look for the website, the announcement. I think the panel members will provide you some interesting perspectives on where quality is today and where quality is going. So look forward to that. And when it gets announced, please sign up early. It's very, very important. I think we've had such a success there in the past. I think it'll be a good venue for us. Tonight we have a very special speaker, Mr. White. Thomas White has an interesting career. He's been on the side of angels in his government service, and he's been on the dark side like me, the contractor, who has the only intention, of course, of exploiting all the possible money we possibly can from the federal government and give it to our friends. But Mr. White is not that character. He's a man who believes in doing the right thing the right way and doing the right thing lawfully. And we're going to talk a little bit about FAR tonight and the importance of quality. If you're going to do proper government contracts, you need to understand FAR. And that's not far, far away. Years ago, when I was playing as a musician, one of these guys, people in bars can be very rude. And he comes up to me and says, "Mr. Mullins," says, "Hey, can you play Far, Far Away?" And I said, "Well, sure." He said, "Please." So this is a different FAR. And Mr. White's going to be talking. That was supposed to be a joke. That was my only joke of the night. Tell you, you're a hard audience. You're a hard audience. So with that, Mr. White, would you please come up? Okay. I
don't know. It sounds like a tough audience.
It is a tough audience.
I'm going to use this little stool, I guess. I got a bad hip, so I'm not going to stand the whole time. And then I'm also supposed to have this close to me. Is that
on the table?
It's okay?
Yeah.
I'd like to suggest we make this an interactive session. Don't get scared by the 3-page handout. I'm not going to go over all of that. That would take more than the time allotted, which I guess we're going to go to 9 o'clock. Yeah. So I'm going to jump around some on this handout. Did everybody get one, by the way? So I'll not only please ask questions as we go through looking at this paper, but I'm going to ask you questions too, to have some interaction here. I know there's at least one government employee here and one retired government employee. Anybody else on the government side here? Oh, wow. So as federal employees or military? Okay. Well, as a matter of fact, my background is I did 36 years federal service, Navy Department, and NASA. I was director of logistics at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. I was there for 18 years. Another 18 years I was with the Navy Department. First 6 years back in the early 70s. Actually started in '69. Went into the Navy. 6 years active duty, and want to ship off to Vietnam. So, and then once I got a government job, I did 20 years in the reserve. So I'm different, military and so we're going to talk tonight about services contracts, as opposed to what is the other major type of government contract besides services.
Acquisition.
Well, they're both acquisition, but I think you're talking probably hardware, right?
Yes.
So we call that in the FAR supply. So those are the two main type of government contracts are for services, and the other are supply or supplies. And that can even include DoD weapon systems acquisitions, that's hardware, although there's a lot of service contracts that can support those kind of requirements of DoD. And a lot of hardware acquisition contracts have services built into them too. So they'll have a combination a lot of times. But DoD, I went to a Defense Acquisition University symposium a few months ago, and the Assistant Secretary of Defense spoke related to acquisition course over there. And he actually said DoD for the first time last year spent more money on services contracts than hardware contracts. So they're putting more and more emphasis on service contracts to be sure that they're managed well, and we don't have Washington Post events that do not help the credibility of the federal government whenever those kind of things happen. And of course, it could be abuse of the federal taxpayers' money too. So, what do we think? What do you think a service is, as opposed to the other major category are hardware or products or supplies. So, what's a service?
Labor.
Okay. So it's basically where a contractor is performing tasks or support to a federal agency or doing things. And of course, it's gotten more prevalent of federal agencies contracting things out. When Bush II was president, that was actually one of his management agenda items, was that the federal government should use commercial entities for doing a lot of the housekeeping services, the housekeeping work. And so even DoD, and I, with my background in DoD, when I was in the reserves and used to go down to Norfolk Naval Supply Center, the warehouses were all operated by civil servants. Today, probably, and Defense Logistics Agencies taking over most of those kind of operations, you'll find contractors doing it. So it's all part of that, and of course the the A76 analyses that are done to determine who can do the job more efficiently, and which usually means for less cost. Is it the government or a contractor? So all of those kind of things have influenced this. Okay, so we're going to talk about the quality assurance requirements in services contracts. That's what we're focusing on, not the hardware contracts. And that's, and I teach for a training company, core training courses, the certification courses that they're 40 hours to become a certified core level 2. And so all federal employees have to take some kind of training like that, and they use vendors quite a bit, to become a core. We used to call it COTR, remember? I don't know why they took the T out. I don't like it, but one of these days I'll talk to somebody that was involved and find out why they took the T out. But anyway, it's technically now core contracting officers representative, not contracting officers technical representative. So what other type of contracts are there, categories of contracts, just, quiz you a little bit, besides service contracts and hardware contracts? Any other special categories anybody's aware of?
Time and material, time and labor, or something like that?
Well, yeah, that's more, what I'm referring to is the FAR covers some special requirements for some other categories besides services and supply. Anybody think of any other special type of contracts that the FAR covers for additional requirements? How about construction? Building buildings, building roads. That's a category that has special sections in the FAR that are different than for services. Those are not considered service contracts. They're a special category. So here's some other ones just for your interest, I guess. They're really called construction and architectural engineering services. Major systems, DoD, weapon system acquisitions. This isn't in your, I'm ad-libbing here a little. R&D, research and development. There's special requirements in the FAR for those type of contracts. And those can be, well, we'll get into fixed price versus cost reimbursable a little bit. And then you all have heard, and I know some of you may have your company may be on a federal supply schedule. Those are a special type of contract that have special requirements that federal agencies have to follow. And of course, the General Services Administration administers for the whole federal government the federal supply schedules. And then, of course, IT service contracts. There's some special requirements for those type of contracts. And then commercial items, which is a major emphasis in the federal government. The government wants to use commercial items instead of developing its own requirements. Like, what's an example of a commercial item that we all use? Yeah, okay. What I was thinking of myself was an automobile. The government doesn't say normally, okay, I need a security contract vehicle, or not a contract, but if it's in-house, we need automobiles, you know, for operating our security program. You can go out and find what you need that industry's already developed for the general public and just use one of those instead of designing and giving engineering requirements to a company. That would be very expensive. Of course, we do that in DoD a lot for MRAPs, the armored vehicles. Those are not commercial items. Those are not generally available to the public. So there's a major emphasis section in the FAR 12 is the commercial item regulations. So here's the FAR. Everybody has never seen it. Half of it is regulations that some of this stuff we're talking about. The other half are the clauses that go into the contracts, and that's what you're all familiar with. If you have a government contract, you don't see the regulations in your contract, you see the clauses that implement the regulations. So if anybody wants to see it, it's available. The other thing I have here that I'll pass around is a binder of different documents of things I'm talking about tonight. So I'll just pass this around, and also on the second page at the bottom there's a list of some acronyms, so whenever I say something, maybe you might find the acronym on the back page, or you can ask me, what does that stand for? Like FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation. Is this still, there's no light on it now? Did it die? Let's find out if it is. Just thought I'd mention it. Okay, so I'm going to address primarily the core role and the contract project or program manager's role in quality assurance. And this is kind of a high level of what the overall regulations require in the FAR. And of course, a lot of what's in the FAR is actually implementing what's in the law. Congress likes to impose its will on the acquisition process for various reasons. So a lot of this is not just regulation, which sometimes you can get exemptions from regulations in the federal government. You can't get a waiver or an exemption from law unless Congress gives it to you. So a lot of this in here is actually in law, such as the requirements for competition, which is the law requires, it's mandatory, there's no fuzz on it, the Competition and Contracting Act. We call it CICA for short. So that's all embedded in there. So whenever Congress changes the law or court decisions change law or regulations, then it gets embedded by the FAR Council into the FAR that's applicable to all federal agencies, including DOD, although they are the biggest gorilla in the whole federal procurement process. The government spends over $500 billion per year on government contracts. You know, so you can, you know, you said you wanted to
Feed our families.
yeah, feed your family and all that. And of course, there was that little wrinkle that happened a couple of years ago called sequestration budget cuts. And federal agencies actually had to either stop their acquisition process on some of their acquisitions, or they actually had to de-scope some of their contracts because they no longer had the money to completely fund their current contracts. And of course, the government has the unilateral right, and some people in industry don't always understand this, but the companies and industry has no right to have a contract if the government says, I don't have a need anymore for it. So the government can end a contract or de-scope a contract at the convenience of the government at any time. And that's exactly what they did. And it's not termination of the contract for default. The contractors weren't doing anything. It's for convenience of the government because requirements have changed. If the government doesn't have the money, you know, you don't want to violate the Anti-Deficiency Act and try to buy something you do not have money appropriated by Congress. So the main policy section in the front part here is FAR 46, Quality Assurance, and it prescribes the procedures to ensure supplies and services, we're talking both in this case, conform to the contract's quality and quantity requirements by specifying the contractor's inspection system or program for quality control and the government's quality assurance inspection acceptance procedures to assure that contractor's work conforms to the contract requirements. That's pretty old. That's all it is. The contractor must have its own inspection system at the minimum for services contracts to inspect its own work. And we'll actually look at one of the clauses that I have attached to your handout. And the government actually depends upon the contractor to be the first line of defense for ensuring that the government gets what it's paid for. The contractor is responsible. So the contractor should have more comprehensive quality control system or program and inspecting its own work than the government does. And that's generally the way it works. The government always has the right to inspect anything the contractor does to ensure the work meets contract requirements. But, you know, if the government, a corps or a quality team on the government side, and of course the government can use contractors to help them do that, that's another thing. They would, you know, you'd be spending all of your time on government resources and government personnel monitoring everything the contractor is doing, and the government doesn't want to do that. They're putting the onus on the contractor to do their own inspection to ensure the work is conforming to the contract requirements.
So how does that work out? The government is requiring the contractor to perform its own inspection. How do they avoid that the foxes are guarding the house?
Well, because then that's where the government has the right, and we'll see in the inspection clause that's attached here, to review, and I'm actually covering some of the, you know, some of the stuff in the handout here, so that's great. The government has a right to, the clauses actually say, most of them, that the contractor shall establish an inspection system. Now that's just the minimum. If the government wants a full-blown comprehensive quality control program, then I tell my classes, these budding corps, put it in the statement of work. Because the inspection system, it should be, the contractor should develop written procedures and processes, but the government can't really, based on just that clause, say, well, you have to have a fully comprehensive quality control program. You could even say, as an example, conforms to ISO 9000 and all. No. The inspection system is just the minimum. So if you want a really formal, and of course I'm talking now from the government perspective, if you really want to have the contractor have that kind of a requirement in the contract, put it in your statement of work. And it's the Corps' responsibility and the technical organization to write the statement of work. Everybody knows that, I guess, right? The CO is overall in charge, and they are the overall federal agency's legal representative for the agency for a government contract. But Corps, when they receive their delegation letter from the CO, and it's not a generic delegation, it's per contract. So when a federal employee receives this delegation letter, it's for contract ABC, and it lays out what the roles and responsibility of the Corps is. And but in that role, a Corps is also a legal representative of the United States government for those delegated responsibilities. And actually, the FAR, in all the wording, there's only a couple small paragraphs in this whole FAR that refer to a Corps. All of the guidance in here says the CO shall do this, the CO may do this, the CO will do A, B, or C at its discretion, you know, or whatever. And so the inspection regulations actually say the CO shall inspect the work of the contractor. But that doesn't make sense, does it? Because COs are trained in the overall FAR, the laws, the regulations on contracting, but they don't know the technical work. That's the reason we have Corps that are the representative of the technical organization. They hopefully have the expertise the Corps does for that particular area, whether it's IT, logistic services like where I was, security services or whatever. But they work for their own technical organization, and they also work for the CO. But the Corps is really a very critical position because they are on the firing line day in and day out with the contractor. The CO is sitting back normally, and of course I was an old-timer, and I was a Corps for a couple of years, but as a division director, the way we worked at NASA, you know, I was giving technical direction to my contractor and to my organization of 50 people, all at the same time, because most of all the work was being done by the contractor, all the day-to-day work. So my program manager for my major contract, he attended all my staff meetings, you know, all the planning meetings, strategic planning, et cetera, et cetera. So when even though I had a Corps, it was one of my branch heads, I'm giving out direction, and this is not uncommon, even though the FAR doesn't talk about that. It says the Corps will do all of this stuff. Well, in reality, other management people are involved in giving direction to the contract. So anyway, the Corps is very critical because, and it's an important role, and there was even a GAO report last year about criticizing the Corps training in the federal government. It needs to be improved. So 40 hours of training, that's what we give. It's a 5-day class for Corps Level 2. And that's another 40 or 60 hours for Corps Level 3, the highest. But that's where all the action's going on, is between the Corps, the technical office, and the contractor. The contracting officer's back there and trying to manage or oversee probably 20 different contracts. And some federal employees that are Corps say, I can't even get I can't get a hold of my contracting officer. I need to ask him a question or something. They're so busy, and it's like, don't call me unless you have something really critical. So the Corps is really, and of course each federal agency has its own kind of culture of how they do this, but the Corps is really critical and can really screw something up, a violation of law and regulations if they don't do things properly, and can impact the contractor's livelihood, obviously, too. Okay, so I'm on 3 now. The delegation memo specifies the roles and responsibility from the CO to the Corps. And the primary quality assurance clauses for services contracts are the 2 listed right below there. FAR 52-246-4, inspection of services fixed price. And the next one is -5, inspection of services cost reimbursable. And I'm sure you all know there's only 2 types of contracts within the federal government. They're all either a fixed price contract or a cost reimbursable contract. I'll jump ahead down or jump to the bottom because this might fit nicely here down on key design components. FAR policy 37102, contracts for services shall be fixed price and performance based to the maximum extent possible. So I would put money on it, be a good bet, better than the Virginia lottery or something, that if I go into a federal agency and I just pick out any service contract in there and say, what is it? Security services. I'll bet that is fixed price. And it may be considered commercial services or maybe not. And I think, probably 95% of the time I'll be right. Now, cost reimbursable contracts can be for services if the CO agrees to that and the right circumstances apply. My contract at NASA was a cost reimbursable contract, about 225 work years, people on it, and I loved it. We'll talk a little bit with time about managing cost reimbursable contracts and why the FAR says service contracts shall be fixed price as the first order of precedence and shall be performance based to the maximum extent possible. And then if it doesn't make sense because the criteria, the type of work it is, and again it's driven by the statement of work, that it's not appropriate to be fixed price, then it can be cost reimbursable. So that would be the second option, performance-based cost reimbursable, and then third, non-performance-based.
So help me understand on a fixed price contract why an agency contracting officer would also want to know the labor categories, the labor rates, and the hours expended under a contract, and we agreed that we're going to deliver the following deliverables at a fixed price.
Because of the competition process, in the evaluation of, by the technical evaluation panel and the cost panel, or the CO in many cases is just doing the cost proposal, price proposal evaluation. The government wants to ensure that it's going to get the right amount of labor and the categories and the levels of personnel that the contract is proposing in order to provide services. And the government is making that decision based normally on past experience with similar contracts, how many people it takes to do the work.
How is that really different than a agreed upon level of effort and price? Because now you're managing at the micro level. I'm reporting back to you on a monthly basis the labor categories and hours expended under the contract. And I don't understand.
You're only going to report that on a cost reimbursable contract. Fixed price contract, you're going to take that, whatever the term is, common is 5-year contract with 1-year base period and 4 1-year option periods. You're going to just take whatever that price is, let's say it's $100,000 for the first year, you're going to divide $100,000 by 12, and you have the right, after you perform properly, after each month, to bill the government for 1/12 of what that fixed price was or is. Okay? So we don't care about your labor categories. As a matter of fact, that's an incentive for you. If you can do the work with less people, that's why a lot of companies love fixed price contracts, because they can make more money than on a cost reimbursable contract. So if you can scale down with doing efficiencies, process improvement, business practices improvement, and so forth, to scale down your labor and still meet all the contract requirements, the quality requirements, meet all the performance standards, you're allowed to do that. Conversely, if you underbid it and the government didn't catch that, then you better add some more labor on there. That's the risk you take on a fixed price contract in order to meet the contract requirements. Okay, but it's only on cost reimbursable contracts that you report all the labor categories, the rates, and so forth. And that's why those are much more complex to manage by the contractor and the government. They're more complex to administer. And as I have on that second page, applying best practices in contract management, number 8. On cost reimbursable contracts, I indicate both the core in the technical organization and the contractor PM must monitor the contract workload and costs, and we call that the burn rate, to prevent cost overrun. So when there's a cost overrun on a government contract, it's really a dual problem. The contractor gets the blame, but there have been project managers, and the James Webb Space Telescope, which is under development right now, that's going to replace the Hubble Space Telescope. That there about 5 years ago, there was I don't know, it was $1 billion, but it was 100 million of, overrun, and somebody had to take the fall for it, so they removed the project manager at COTR and assigned him to some little peanut project, and 6 months later he retired. But, the FAR says, oh, the contractor's going to be responsible for this, but look, when Congress sees that the government has a cost overrun, they know that it's the fault of both the federal agency and the contractor, because federal agencies have to monitor and manage these cost reimbursable contracts much more closely. The risk is on the government to ensure the contractor performs, whereas on fixed price contracts, the risk is on the contractor. You take the risk for what you're bidding that the government accepts on cost, resources, how to do it, and so forth. And then we hold your feet to the fire on a fixed price contract to meet all of the contract requirements. The FAR actually says on a cost reimbursable contract that the contractor must, and government employees have a hard time buying this, the contractor must exert its best efforts to perform the contract requirement. Best efforts. That's in the FAR. So that's where the government really has to more closely manage a cost reimbursable contract to ensure that the right work is being done, the right priorities, and that the money, the burn rate, is consistent with what the budget is. Yes,
a number of years ago, the granddaddy of all cost overruns took place with Lockheed C-5 Galaxy, and they built the thing 100% to spec to what the Air Force wanted. But what had happened, the Army decided to change the dimensions and the weight of the M1 Abrams tank to where Lockheed had to go back and re-engineer the cargo doors as well as the wing roots and everything else. Now, how do you, what is in place to prevent something like that where one government agency doesn't talk to another government agency?
Yeah. I mean, it takes two to tango. And these problems, a lot of times the government causes them. But the contractor should be smart enough to advise the government, this is what's going on. Sometimes government officials don't listen. Okay, let's get back to some of the basics here. So those are the reason we have two different types of clauses. There's actually 12 different clauses relating to inspection and acceptance. So it depends on what type of contract it is. Construction contracts have their own dedicated clause. And by the way, all construction contracts in the federal government are fixed price. Just like the Metro, they had the cost overruns. That's not, that was the airport's authority. But they're using some of the basic, same kind of approaches as the federal contract. Okay, quality assurance tasks of the Corps. Now some of these are not just quality assurance. roles, its overall contract management. So let's zip through these. Monitor the contractor's performance, or the contract performance, services, task schedules, and deliverables. AB, provide technical direction to the contractor on government's needs and priorities, and that applies to whether it's a fixed price contract or cost reimbursable. Provide technical direction, got that? Inspect and accept. This is the key critical area the Corps has that's delegated to them. Inspect and accept all of the contractor's work and deliverables, or to reject the work or deliverables, and to direct the contractor to fix the non-conforming work. And it doesn't matter if it's a cost reimbursable contract or a fixed price contract, that principle applies. The only difference is, who knows about who pays for corrective actions between those two.
If it's cost plus, or I mean, it's the government's penny. If it's
Absolutely.
If it's the other one, it's the
fixed price
contractor.
contracts, the Corps, you give a deliverable to the government, to the Corps. He or she inspects it, says this is non-conforming, you know, you need to go back and blah, 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 do this. The study report takes another 3 months, go back and redo it. That's the risk on fixed price contracts that industry takes. They have to eat it out of hide to fix that non-conforming work. However, on cost reimbursable contracts, and this is again, we're talking services primarily, but this is a basic principle on cost reimbursement or fixed price contracts, any of those. The Corps will direct the contractor, go back and fix this. Take another 3 months, if you need to redo this analysis. Well, guess what? You get to pay, you the government, get to pay double for that report because the contractor has the right, all embedded in the FAR, for billing the government for any work it does, best efforts. So again, the Corps and the technical organization need to more closely watch what's going on in a cost reimbursable contract because the risk is more on the government. You have the right to direct the contractor to go back and fix it, but you're going to get a bill for it. You may end up paying double. That's just the nature of the beast. And that's why, again, the FAR says for services contracts, they shall be fixed price, performance-based to the maximum extent possible. Again, put the risk on the contractor instead of the government of doing conforming all the work to the contract requirements. So for rejected work, non-conforming work, the contractor has to re-perform it, or for services, you can't necessarily re-perform it. I had a bus, shuttle bus services, one of the services my contractor ran the shuttle bus between Goddard Space Flight Center and NASA headquarters 5 times a day. Well, if they screwed up and didn't meet the schedule, I'm not going to tell them, go back and redo that 10 o'clock schedule. But what the clause says is correct future work. You had non-conforming work, so fix it for the future. So let's look at the clause. Here's the real-world clause, the 3rd page here. And the reason I always give this one out in my classes is because of that exact reason. FAR says services contracts shall be fixed price and performance-based to the maximum extent. This is a very powerful clause, and it's weighted heavily in favor of the government, which, by the way, all federal government contracting is heavily weighted in favor of the government. So, the contractor shall provide and maintain an inspection system acceptable to the government. That means the government, the Corps, with the contractor's officer's assistance if necessary, has a right to tell the contractor, I want to see your inspection system. Give me a copy of your inspection system. And this isn't the full-blown quality control program. And the Corps, backed up with the CO in this case, should review your inspection system, and then if they see any problem with it, such as you're not covering sufficient critical areas in the scope of work, you're missing some tasks that we, the government, feel you should include in your quality reviews, the Corps technically the CO can direct you change your inspection system. That applies also to a quality control plan, okay? So again, it has to be, that's the common language, it has to be acceptable to the government, which is legalese, meaning the government can review it, and if they don't like it, they can tell you to change it. That's the way it works. Now you can try and argue and say, well, I don't think that is, we don't need to do this, but pretty much so, the government's going to have the last say on this. And as you all know, that our government contractors, you want to please your client, right? You don't want to argue with them too much. Yes, sir.
So one of the interesting things, my experience has been both as a Fed and as a contractor, particularly in the area of quality assurance and quality control, that the FAR appears to be written in a time when we were still chiseling things into stone. And most of the quality control requirements that I have are just so inadequate that they're meaningless. Give me an example. One of my clients, when I was a Fed, was trying to be compliant with quality inspection, quality control for environmental protection purposes. And we were looking for time-stamped digital output measurements. They put in continuous feed systems to monitor emissions in real time. They were written up as non-compliant because they needed to go back and take out the new technology and put it digital at the time where you do samples at sequences. There was the organizations, the quality assurance and quality control requirements had not yet kept up with the technology. Another example, I recall I was writing a quality assurance and quality control plan for a healthcare system that's
requirements and you need to be a smart buyer on the technical side of the house, not just totally depend on the contracting officer. The contracting officers don't know necessarily the work and the ins and outs, although sometimes they specialize in certain areas like IT or whatever, and they get fairly savvy. So you really need to be a smart buyer in the technical organization. And of course, DAU has their project management organization, over DAU, 6 months of training to become a project manager for major contracts in DoD. NASA has its own academy for project management. Most of the other federal agencies, civilian ones, don't have that. I think DHS is got that now too. So that's all.
So when you look at the acquisition process, what trumps what? Is it the adherence to the regulations or to the value and mission of the agency? What trumps what when you have a dispute?
Well, it's a combination. It's both. Cost is a driver always, but it's what the FAR says it in and out, what's in the best interest of the federal agency or the federal government, as far as mission needs and so forth.
Here's why I asked the question the way I did is years ago I was a classification appeals officer for a federal agency, and most classifiers believe that there are standards. They're not standards, they're guidelines. And the preamble says that these guidelines are not a substitute for management judgment. Right. But we seem to lose that piece when we start, because all the acquisitions we've just been talking about are incredibly complex, interdependent, and they are working to achieve the deliverables, working with a highly leveraged, knowledge-based team. Right. There's 1,000 moving pieces. The acquisition officer or the contracting officer with the core have to be able to navigate those things in the best interest of the government, consistent with regulations. Right. Now there's at least 3 variables there we just talked about that have to be put in play at all times. And the requirements were that every 90 days we do a quality assurance and quality control audit, identify deficiencies, and put a plan together for correction. We won that contract, and if I was compliant with that requirement, I could have 350,000 deficiencies every 90 days. We certainly, since it's a fixed price contract, we're not going to have 350,000 deficiencies. Yeah. But it's interesting in my mind that the contractors who wrote the acquisition, put the acquisition strategy together instead of the requirements, instead of asking best in breed and best in thought, we're still cutting and pasting something that was completely inconsistent with their own best interest. Can you speak to that?
Well, I really think that there should be some mandatory training and contracts for all federal is embedded in law. And so, you know, if you violate federal law, it can be
Inconvenient?
enhancing.
Yeah, not good.
And as I tell the classes, my classes, in a joking way, I guess, I say, well, if you as a Corps willfully violate law and regulations, it will not be career enhancing. The only upside is if it's serious enough, if it's egregious enough, you might get free room and board at a federal facility. And Darlene Druyan, who was the procurement executive of the Air Force about 20 years ago, violated law by trying to get Boeing to hire her nephew, I believe it was, or son-in-law,
And yourself.
And herself.
and she actually got free room and board for I don't know how many years, but it can be very serious, this stuff. That's why a Corps is a legal representative of the United States government in the role that they play. It's a very, sometimes in the classes I teach, particularly, I won't say which agency, but I get halfway through the 5-day class and somebody says, I don't want to be a Corps anymore. You know, they're scared, you know. I mean, you don't try to scare people, but this is serious stuff. Okay, okay, we've covered costs, who pays on correcting non-conforming work, depending if it's a fixed price or cost reimbursable services contract. So the Corps the Corps inspects and accepts the work, the deliverable, or rejects it. So what does it mean? What's the legal significance when the Corps accepts the contractor's work or the deliverable? What's the legal term that refers to? Well, yes, it conforms to the contract requirements, so it's acceptable work. But when the Corps signs a piece of paper and says, "I now accept it for the United States government," what does that signify?
Is it government property now?
Ownership. The government is taking ownership of that. Okay? And the FAR says that in most cases, once the government accepts ownership, it has very few remedies if it later finds non-conforming work. Now there's a few things called like latent defect wasn't discovered at the time of the inspection, or things called fraud. Then the exception is no, the government has remedies to go after the contractor for corrective work, and there's also criminal actions too, generally, when that happens, besides the corrective work that's needed to be done. The Corps, if it's delegated to him or her, also has the authority to clarify the statement of work requirements with the contractor. Why is that? Because the Corps in the technical organization wrote the statement of work. They know what it's supposed to mean. And generally, now, if a contractor disagrees with that, they have a right to say, no, that isn't what I did, particularly on a fixed price contract. If it's cost reimbursable, a lot of contractors say, oh, that's what it means, you want me to do that? Fine, you're just going to get the bill for it, okay? But on fixed price contracts, if the contractor says, I didn't bid that, that's not, that isn't what I have in my price, well then that will get elevated to the contracting officer, and the contractor officer will make a decision, and then contractors do have rights. There is the disputes clause that the contractor can even dispute the contracting officer's final decision, but then again you're getting into some.
That brings up an interesting thing. How many people here do services contracts for the government? How many times have you been at a kickoff meeting and the contracting representative says, well, that's all good, but here's what we need you to do now?
All the time.
That's my life.
Is the CEO in the meeting?
The contracting officer in the meeting too. The I mean, we're talking top executives in government, and it's saying, but when we wrote that, priorities have changed. We need to focus on this now.
But if it's within the scope of the statement of work, that's okay.
Well, do good things for good people is normally the general scope of work. Do what I need now is really the. But what's interesting, again, this is I'm not trying to play devil's advocate here, but I think this is instructional point is one of the challenges of the acquisition process. By the time they get the acquisition out, they actually go and we all write our proposals. We actually evaluate the proposals and we get something. The problem has changed. And to go back and say, I need to change the scope, I need to change it, that puts it back again. There is no quick fix process. And the dynamics, and of course, it's
say one big problem. I haven't done this a lot. I've been at court a couple of times, but there's always protests, and that puts us behind. It does change the scope because our business as the government is continuing to go on, and we're having to deal with the protests from all the contractors in the contract. And in that time, of course, the scope's going to change because it takes us forever to get through that process. The big time the work we really want to get done isn't getting done because we're having to deal with protests.
And that goes back to my other point when I was asking you about what trumps what. So I'm in this meeting, and the client says, I really need you to do this, not that. My response is, I need to stay within the scope of the work for which we bid. But I'll give you that also. But, and now think about what that means though. That means we have said the client's satisfaction and the mission of the agency trumps our scope of work. It's incumbent upon us to be imaginative, creative, and within that budget, deliver on not only what they ask for, but what they need. And that changes the dynamic.
You do have to be careful about violating the law. The Competition and Contracting Act that says all acquisitions in the federal government shall be full and open unless it's authorized, such as a set aside or it's going to be sole source, and then you have to go through a lot of red tape in order to document why it can't be full and open competition. So you have a right, if you feel the government is trying to make you do a new task outside the scope of your contract, to say, we'll do it, but we would like to submit a request for equitable adjustment. It's your
not
right
in the
to
budget,
do that.
and the answer is no, because it's already the money's already been appropriated. It's
Well,
an issue.
anyway,
I know, but that goes back to the difference between the theory and the practice.
Well, yeah, and some federal agencies have better contracting shops and better qualified professional people on the technical side administering contracts than other federal agencies. Okay, they're not all. Okay, let's finish this up real quick. We've got about 5 minutes on what the Corps is responsible for doing. Conducting inspections of the contractor's work. And again, we're talking about services contracts using a QASP. Everybody know what a QASP is? Quality Assurance Surveillance Plan. It's not part of the contract. It's a government document that lays out all of the tasks that are going to be inspected on the contract, primarily related to what's in the statement of work. And that can be changed at any time. You just can't add new metrics above and beyond what was in the basic contract when it was awarded. Otherwise, you have the possibility of the contractor saying, you're adding new work that was not in the scope of what I bid, particularly on a fixed price contract, and I'll do whatever you want me to do, government, but I want to submit a request for equitable adjustment. In other words, I want more money because you're having me do new work that I did not bid on.
Right.
Okay. And then keep the CO apprised, of course, and help on modifications, help the CO on that. Prepare the annual CPARS report, contractor assessment report that has to be done now at the end of every contract, and the Corps should do one every year. The contractor has the right to see it and can dispute it at the end of the contract if it's not fair and objective. Okay, quickly, the contractor PM quality assurance task, establish an inspection system or a quality control program if it's specified in the contract, acceptable to the government. The government has a right to review it and say, I want you to change it if we don't feel it's comprehensive enough or is hitting all of the key areas that should be reviewed by the contractor. And then manage, of course, the contract operations and the inspection or quality system. That means all work, tasks, and deliverables are inspected for contract compliance prior to delivery to the government. So that's where the onus is on the contractor, and of course, if you're on the government side, you need to be sure that the contractor is doing that. And they are the first line of defense on quality is the contractor themselves. And then finally, the contractor should report performance issues and results of the periodic quality reviews to the Corps of the CO, and of course along with accomplishment status and so forth. So that's real simple. I got a whole long list for the Corps, just 3 bullets for the project manager. I was a project manager, program manager for 2 years for a small business for their $89 million IDIQ contract. So I had experience on the other side of the fence where I got beat up by the government, maybe unfairly sometimes, just like I used to beat my contractor up sometimes. I can't imagine it at all. So, anyway, you can read through some of this. Is pretty self-explanatory. And any other questions?
Tom, what has been the impact on quality assurance of the award criteria being least cost technically acceptable?
LPTA. Industry generally hates it. Anybody like LPTA, low price technically acceptable? No. Even DoD has changed its approach. It was actually using LPTA for complex IT requirements. And the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Acquisition, Logistics, blah, 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 whatever the title is, put out a guidance memo to all DoD about 2 months ago saying, clarifying when it's appropriate to use LPTA instead of the trade-offs approach, where you can give, you score the proposals based on additional benefits, innovations, and so forth. Whereas if you're doing LPTA, it's generally fixed price. Are you going to industry provide extra bells and whistles that are going to cost more? No, because the way that process basically works is the tech evaluation panel, which I've been on some of those, will identify all of the technical proposals that are minimally technically acceptable. So if you throw in extra bells and whistles, you don't get any more credit for that because the decision by the CO or whoever the source selection official is whoever is in that group of low price, technically acceptable, minimally technically acceptable, low price gets it. So that's why the old saying, you get what you pay for. All right. Okay. Any other questions?
Question about supervised.
Yeah.
Government-wide or DoD?
Government-wide. Some federal agencies weren't really doing it. The FAR has been beefed up in the last year or two. I taught one class at a federal agency unnamed, and I said, okay, this is the CFARs, and some of these were seasoned corps. And they said, what's this CFAR? They hadn't been doing it. Anybody else? Oh, one more.
Is there anything on the contractor side if the government doesn't give you any feedback when you give them a deliverable or doesn't agree to take ownership of anything?
And you bring that to the government's attention?
Well, we look for reassurance. Did they accept it? Or
Well, sure, that's what the Corps should do. The Corps
they don't even have time to look.
The Corps should give you feedback, and actually, should put it in writing that they have, for their own record, their Corps file, that they haven't inspected and accepted that deliverable. And so they should give feedback to the contractor. Yes, we've gotten it. Now,
You can't bill for those.
I must admit.
Well, the other thing is they paid our invoice, so
Absolutely.
Can we assume that it's accepted at that point?
Well, what are we talking about? Fixed price or cost reimbursable?
Fixed price.
Okay.
Generally, yeah. There's no time limit on fixed price contracts. There's no specific time limit like there are in some of the cost reimbursable contracts. There's a 60-day limit, and if the government doesn't get back to you, then the law says then it's implied the government accepted it.
Okay.
But if you give a deliverable to a federal agency, let's say it's some kind of a study report or something, and they're using it, the law basically says in the regulations that using something implies they've accepted it. So you have some defense that way there too.
What guarantee does a contractor have when they bring something totally unique to the government to manage a program that they will be able to retain their proprietary chip on it. A good example, the Navy's Polaris missile program and PERT, Program Evaluation Review Technique, was invented for that. It is now part of undergraduate operations management.
Well, my expertise is more in services contracts. I haven't gotten into hardware systems acquisitions, and again, if it's fixed price, it depends if it's fixed price, cost reimbursable, what other clauses are in the contract would drive what happens there. If the government is paying you to develop that, the government, especially on cost reimbursable contracts, they're paying you, you get it with their nickel, the government's going to say, that's our product.
That's ours.
Right. But if you already develop something, you bring it into the contract,